kind of funding and the kind of scientific attention COVID received, you very quickly had candidates for vaccines. And the first generation were the mRNA vaccine.
Oxford University, for instance, had already announced that it had a promising front-running candidate.
The great news was that almost all sort of started to show promise and potential. When people realized that, the United States and UK had no intention of allowing these vaccines to go out, they had already contractually bound many manufacturers from not sending these vaccines elsewhere. They had to 100% be delivered to their governments. A lot of hope shifted to India.
This month, last year, if you read the headlines, you would have imagined that the Oxford University candidate would have been the vaccine that saved the world. And in many ways it was. But what happened over the rest of the year was that a couple of divisions emerged. Like Leena said, Western countries, a handful of countries, so this counts for about 15 to 20% of the world's population, they put in pre-orders for these vaccines. They funded the research and development of these vaccines and made sure that they got in first in line. The Covax facility, which was an organization consisting of the WHO, the World Health Organization, and Cepi, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, and GAVI, led by GAVI, the Vaccines Alliance, they stepped in and said, look, poor countries, we've got you, right? To half the world, they said, we've got you. As things went along, there is an anomaly that stood out, which is India. Because India is a poor country with great vaccine manufacturing capacity. And one Western vaccine manufacturer, ASTRAZENECA, partly because of Oxford's insistence before they sold the vaccine, before they exclusively licensed their vaccine to AstraZeneca that it must be produced elsewhere, entered into a large access agreement with the Serum Institute in India.
Particularly if you look at the history of GAVI, they have always been very reticent about challenging big pharma and the intellectual property. So they were unwilling to actually stand up and tell AstraZeneca and the others that, look, your licensing models need scrutiny. We would like to see these at contract. We would like to see if we could add more manufacturers in India, for example. If Serum Institute can make vaccines at 65 million doses, can you imagine if we had added a couple of more manufacturers? India would not be in a position to choose between its own people and people in developing countries. And I think this is where we really need to start asking the difficult questions from big pharma.
The AstraZeneca deal with Serum is being held up as the gold standard of what the Western pharmaceutical industry can do for the world to help the world, right? And a part of what we are trying to say is that this is not much. Not only is it not working, it's kind of catastrophic. In consultation with the wise old man standing by the road, which is all of these institutions, the WHO, GAVI, and Cepi, when you throw 12.5% of the vaccines needed at 4 billion people, then you cannot act surprised that there's a food fight. That you cannot act surprised that they're all scrambling to get that 12.5%. It's an inadequate base of supply to begin with. So this is the sort of original sin that this contract had built into it even last year, which was going to result in the situation today. But how did that happen? When Oxford was researching its vaccine and found itself being an early frontrunner, at first, what they wanted to do was to allow as wide a manufacturing base as possible. The Gates Foundation, now they say, along with others, intervened, gave them advice. On the basis of that advice, they went with a single pharmaceutical company. In Oxford case, it ended up that they signed an exclusive deal with AstraZeneca, which was based in the United Kingdom, which the UK government wanted them to do. Then what happened is that the Covax facility, which, as Leena said again, made false promises last year. They did not negotiate wider licensing. They assumed somehow, magically, 12.5% of the needed vaccines would be fine. Somehow that would work out fine. How? It really defies the laws of nature. Well, the Covax facility continued along the lines that it always has, which was, I think, another fault, which is that it exclusively trusted Western vaccine manufacturers. There were reports that there were vaccines from China, from Russia, from India that showed promise, right? In the same way as these vaccines also showed promise when they were in development, but they didn't talk to them. So they didn't go to these Russian and Chinese suppliers who were going to supply 3 billion doses over this year. The Indian government, I think, unfortunately, in this mess, suddenly seems to have found out 2 months ago in January how many people actually live in this country. And I think this is a bit of a problem because, our population is not a secret. And in January, when they suddenly discovered how many people live here, their first action was to place an order for 10 million doses. The first vaccine order at Serum Institute was for 10 million doses this January. I find that inexcusable because on top of not investing in the research and development or in the scaling up of any of these vaccine manufacturing plants, they decided that the best way to start treating 1.3 billion people is to place an order of 10 million doses. They followed that up with a little drip, 25 million and 25 million and 10 million. And now an order of 100 million, which has halted all exports from Serum. So Serum is contracted to provide this vaccine to 92 countries. It is now providing for the foreseeable future this vaccine to one country.
I mean, that's the big scandal that, while they contractually bought up most of the vaccines and are unwilling to share when they needed those vaccines. And the UK is quite interesting because yesterday I was reading The Guardian and I just realized that they actually provided Australia with the vaccine. So actually they took doses from India and then went on to use some of the doses to supply Australia. And Australia, of course, was struggling to get the doses from the EU. Serum Institute was not supposed to be supplying Canada and the UK. It was only one contract obligation that if AstraZeneca couldn't meet the need, Serum Institute would step in. But that basically means you're diverting what is meant for the developing world to countries like the UK who already vaccinated 50% of their population. So you really wonder whether, why governments like India and the regulatory authorities like the Competition Commission and other, ministries are not opening up that contract to scrutiny and actually, taking action against those obligations.
These are not India's vaccines. In fairness, 35% of them should have been India's vaccines, and yet Serum and the government of India and AstraZeneca had an informal arrangement among them that 50% would be India's vaccines. So that's already a larger share than is due to India, yes? The irony is that even this share, as you pointed out earlier and as Leena pointed out, is being diluted by these extraordinary provisions with UK and the Canada requesting them. What's more absurd is that all the countries getting it and wanting it, Australia, the United Kingdom and Canada, including Brazil, which asked for an emergency shipment, that's not on the list. All of those countries are also currently blocking the Indian proposal to waive pharmaceutical monopolies at the WTO. Right? India and South Africa proposed at the WTO to waive pharmaceutical monopolies to create greater vaccine supply so that countries wouldn't experience shortfalls. Brazil, Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia blocked that proposal and then asked India to solve their shortfalls in supply, which is a beautiful irony. India should have realized long before January that it would need to vaccinate, regardless of the mortality, regardless of the peculiarities of COVID in India. Vaccinations were almost always going to be a certainty for a very large number of people. The government should have realized that quicker than 2 months ago. It should have created a couple of different things: an infrastructure ability for the vaccine manufacturers themselves, capital infusions or loans, other kinds of help to jump through the red tape. It should have intervened to create wider contracts among vaccine manufacturers so that it had a bigger base of supply. It should have made sure that approvals and assessments of vaccines happened rapidly. There is a Sputnik V approval that is in the works. It has been in the works for a while. There is something like 600 million dose capacity for Sputnik. We don't know when that will roll off the shelves because, it's one thing to have a vaccine approved and another to have it in hand, right? But without sufficient options, without the government stepping in to aid those options to come to market, we are going to be just as dependent and we will have the worst outcome possible, which is not only do countries like Nigeria and Ghana continue to live with just 1% of their populations vaccinated, right? We suffer shortfalls and have a massive scramble within this country where people have got one dose and are waiting for a second dose but can't get one, or not everyone eligible can get one. There are crowds and there are complaints.
If you look at today, the most promising vaccines, excluding the vaccine, the Russian vaccine that has been licensed widely to 4 or 5 manufacturers. If you look at Covaxin, you have one manufacturer. If you look at Covishield, you have one manufacturer. If you look at the J&J biological E contract, you can't even talk about it. No one wants to talk about it. Biological E won't even enter into a conversation about talking about that contract. So if you have a single dose vaccine that actually potentially eases the burden on healthcare systems of developing countries, we just don't know what's in that contract. Where do they go? Does India get some? Who gets? How much does Covax get? So the contract between biological E and Johnson & Johnson is shrouded in the same kind of secrecy that, for example, the AstraZeneca and Serum Institute was. And we still will probably see the impact a few months later when there's a scramble for a single dose vaccine. So just don't really understand, when will India's regulators like the Competition Commission see that this is their business of looking at contracts and competition? Why should you have just one manufacturer for a single dose vaccine? Why should you have one manufacturer for Covishield? Why should you have one manufacturer for Covaxin? So that's one. And I think coming back to your prior question, which really has fascinated me in the last 2-3 days about, this demand by, for example, the Delhi Chief Minister about vaccinating everybody. My question to him, and I would love to have a conversation with the Delhi government, is, have you vaccinated your homeless, the most vulnerable? Have you vaccinated all your elderly? Have you vaccinated all your comorbidities? And if you've done that, you've already done a big job on public health. So just, opening it up before you've done this job, I think you're going to create chaos in public health. What we need is a very smart testing strategy, like in HIV, and we need a very smart vaccination strategy. It's not about everyone getting vaccinated. It's about the most vulnerable getting vaccinated.